Welcome to this Broadly Speaking event brought to you by the Wheeler Centre. My name is Scintilla Chindayipe. I'm a journalist and filmmaker. This event was originally supposed to be in person, and really sorry that couldn't get to see the audience and also meet Laurie and Bri in person, but really pleased that it still gets to go ahead online. Thank you for joining us. If you're in lockdown, sending a lot of love your way. I know it's a particularly hard time at the moment, but hopefully this hour of conversation is a welcome distraction from the doom and gloom of the world outside. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm broadcasting from these lands, and the Wheeler Centre is located on these lands. It is unceded sovereign land, and I would like to pay my respects to elders, both past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal elders that might be joining us tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge that in conversations around gender inequity, there can be no gender equity without racial justice, and there can be no racial justice without First Nations justice. Always was, always will be. So tonight's event is presented in partnership with the Wheeler Centre, the Capital and RMIT Culture. The Broadly Speaking series is supported by Christina Campbell Pretty AM and Family and the Copyright Agency Cultural Fund. Would like to thank them for their continued support of this series. Tonight's bookseller is Neighbourhood Books, and you can buy Laurie and Bri's books after the event, and support your local independent booksellers. So, rage and dissent. They say, don't get mad, get even, but can rage itself be fuel for change? Joining me to discuss the usefulness of rage is Bri Lee, who is an author and freelance writer. Her journalism has appeared in publications such as The Monthly, The Saturday Paper, Guardian Australia and Crikey. Her first book, Eggshell Skull, won Biography of the Year at the ABIA Awards, the People's Choice Award at the Victorian Premier Literary Awards, and was longlisted for the 2019 Stella Prize. She's also a non-practicing lawyer and continues to engage in legal research and issues-based advocacy. Welcome, Bri.
Sorry, from Sydney, which is Gadigal land from the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects as well to elders past, present and emerging. And that when I say that this is always was and always will be Aboriginal land, I also mean that I support the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Sorry, thank you.
Wonderful. And last but definitely not least is Laurie Penny, who is an award-winning author, columnist, journalist and screenwriter. Their 7 books include Bitch Doctrine, Unspeakable Things and Everything Belongs to the Future. As a freelance journalist, they write about politics, social justice, pop culture, feminism, mental health and technology for places including The Guardian, Long Reads, Time, BuzzFeed, The New York Times, Vice, Salon, The Nation and The New Statesman. They were a 2014-2015 Nieman Journalism Fellow at Harvard University. As a screenwriter, Laurie has worked on The Nevers, The Haunting, and Carnival Row. Laurie Penny is based between London and Los Angeles. Welcome, Laurie.
I'm also in Melbourne, in lockdown like everybody else. It's really, really nice to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining us. So I thought I'd start just thinking about rage as this energizing force. And I wonder what we mean when we talk about the usefulness of rage. I might start with you, Laurie.
Thank you. So I've been thinking about this a lot over the past couple of days as this event came up, and the question of anger and of rage when it comes to women's politics and women's liberation and is it often comes up, and it often comes up as a framing question. It's not the first time, even in the short while I've been discussing and active in feminist politics, that I've been asked, what does anger have to do with it? What does rage have to do with it? And I've been thinking a lot lately about how people's responses to real and objective political conditions are often reframed as emotional responses rather than rational responses, depending on who that person is, what their background is. And often when, say, for example, women and girls and femme people come out and talk, often in quite measured tones, about their material conditions, you will hear, apologies for the swearing, but you'll hear from the right wing, like, fuck your feelings. When I'm not talking about my feelings, I'm talking about things that are actually going on. I'm talking about economic conditions. I'm talking about actual material oppression. This goes right back to Mary Wollstonecraft and more recently Genevieve Lloyd, the idea of reason and emotion, and the idea that reason in politics is a masculine and masculinized thing, and particularly a white male idea, where white men are the only people who are allowed to see themselves as reasonable and measured, and any response that anybody who is not white or not male has in terms of a response to political conditions and opinion has to be reframed as not just an emotional response, but also an irrational response. I'm often asked, like, why are you so angry? But on a day-to-day basis, I'm not. Maybe that's, I'm actually quite a timid person. That doesn't change what I write about or my opinions on these things. It doesn't mean I'm not deeply moved by what's going on in the world. But I mean, maybe that's partly because of, my background and where I come from. But I've often found that when I am, in some ways, when I'm most articulate, so clearly not today, that's when I'm accused in public, or I'm responded to as if I have blown my lid, as if I've just gone on a massive rant, when actually I've been speaking quite normally. But I don't know how this, I was actually thinking about this and wondering about how that comes across in the courtroom, this idea of controlling emotion.
Bri, how do you think about this idea of the usefulness of rage?
Yeah, I mean, I'm nodding along to a lot of what Laurie just mentioned, especially about this myth of a objective third party who can be rational as distinct from emotional about anything, and just how horrifically the law does that, both in the sort of nuts and bolts pragmatic parts of the process, but the legal professionals doing it, but also sort of philosophically, whether or not a complainant is considered a party to a proceeding or simply a witness to their own matter. It's sort of a question about whose testimony is valued, and something that comes up a lot in my book Eggshell Skull is the ways in which we expect survivors of all kinds to behave in ideal ways. You're allowed to be, if you have been seriously wronged, you're allowed to be a bit upset, but you can't afford to be too upset. Otherwise, you're sort of hyperbolic and hysterical. You can be a little bit angry, but you can't be too angry. Otherwise, you might actually have an ulterior motive or just some vendetta because you hate men. And you can't win. There's no, the line in the sand in the middle is a like mythological place that no person, especially no woman, can ever manage to sort of land on. But what I personally get from anger is honestly, really simply energy. I find anger an energizing force that helps me continue, like, month after month, year after year, to organize. If I wasn't sufficiently angry, I wouldn't still be writing letters to MPs. If I wasn't sufficiently angry, I wouldn't still be doing all of this random research to make submissions to the latest roundtable. I find anger when I am also supported by, a group of fantastic advocates, and it can be sort of fueled into a constructive anger rather than just a dismayed, kind of hopeless anger. It's fantastic.
I respect that so much. Please, sorry, there's a delay.
In this idea of how to where that anger's funneled, and obviously, I'm thinking back to sometime late last year when the Brittany Higgins thing happened, and all of these women's marches were being held around the country. That was clearly a manifestation of women's anger about a situation that didn't appear to be changing or having any kind of resolution. And I guess I wonder, is there a value on the anger, as in whose anger do we value the most in those sorts of circumstances? Am I making?
I would say
makes me think of
close.
Sorry. Why don't we do hands up?
Laurie,
okay.
you go.
You take this one. Yep, good.
Oh, sorry. It makes me think about Brett Kavanaugh in those testimonies in 2018, and your question of whose anger registers, but also whose anger is considered respectable. When you compare Brett Kavanaugh's reaction, I don't know if anybody else was watching live, like the way he just sort of snarled and yelled and was like, I like beer, everyone likes beer, and like spat and pointed, and it seemed frankly unhinged. It certainly, if Christine Blasey Ford, Dr. Blasey Ford, had acted in anything like that way, she would have probably been drummed out of court, although I'm saying this as not a lawyer. But that was considered reasonable testimony from a man who had been so aged as to have his fitness for a role of that magnitude questioned. Like something had got in his way, something had got in the way of everything he felt entitled to, and so he was entitled to behave in that way in public. That wasn't seen as crazy behavior. He wasn't seen as out of control of his own emotions in an appropriate way. But whereas when women speak, especially if they speak about their own experiences, they are considered by default to be emotionally untrustworthy. But women are not expected. The assumption is that women aren't entitled to their own experiences, including their own experiences of their own emotions, because I think as a culture, and it's difficult to say we because I'm new to Australia, but I'm talking about modern feminism in what I experience of the Anglosphere and English-speaking nations. We have a real deep fear of the anger of anyone who is not a white, straight, cisgender, middle-class male. I think there is a profound social fear of what would happen if women were allowed to express all their anger, if people of color were allowed to express all this rage, if working class people were allowed to be collectively angry. I think there is something very, very fearful about that. And I think people who live those experiences learn to internalize that fear. So we fear our own anger. And there is a way that, anger coming from anybody who is not white and male is pathologized. The rage of white men is not seen as a problem for individuals. It's seen as a problem to be socially absorbed and dealt with. Does that make sense?
Mm. Mm.
What I would just add to that as well is that there's a way in which I know I personally am able to just be angry on television, at events, giving speeches in front of thousands of people. That is essentially a tone that is available to me as a tertiary educated, good little middle-class white girl. And I think in the Australian context in the last 12 months, it's been pretty obvious to see, for example, even the difference in response to something like the March for Justice, which was, for women's interests, and there were, of course, women of color there, but a lot of the organizing and very much the face of the movement was a white woman. And there was a way in which that kind of mass protest is received. And when you contrast that to the way the Black Lives Matter protests were received last year, what you see is a very different picture of Australia responding to who gets to be angry, especially in numbers and in public spaces.
And also given that the Black Lives Matter movement was started by Black queer women as well, right? So you could, it's such an interesting thing. And I want to stay with that, Bri, particularly because in Eggshell Skull, you talk about the racial bias within the criminal justice system and the ways this factors into how judgments are handed down. And I wonder, when thinking about rage, I mean, you touched on it there just briefly, the ways in which race and class also factor into who gets to be angry.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the law is, I don't know. The thing I've learned about Australia is that we all like to think that we're the bushrangers and actually we're the coppers. The way the law treats individuals, it's I just go about, and I say all the time, and people agree sort of begrudgingly, like, sure, maybe the bar is like a little bit of a boys' club, and it's like, you know, there's the same sort of white boys who went to the same, you know, private boys' schools. And people can understand that there is a discrepancy between the people who are in power in the legal profession and the people, like the sort of citizens that the legal profession actually deals with and essentially puts in jail. People can appreciate that there's a discrepancy there. But what we seem to still be unwilling to acknowledge is that there is true prejudice in this, like the nuts and bolts of the system itself. That the way the people who do the people who do justice affect the way justice is done. And it's just so shocking that we're seeing, for example, no changes to the rates of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander deaths in custody. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the most incarcerated per capita in the world. That was certainly the case. That stat was accurate when I was writing Eggshell Skull. And yet Tony Abbott says that the reason those Australians are in jail is because they simply commit more crimes. And so what is sort of the impossible situation then that these marginalised groups are put in, one of those groups being Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who have to have any contact with the so-called justice system, is that if you are sort of labelled as a criminal or as somebody who sort of associates with criminals, or as a group of people who are apparently, according to people like Tony Abbott, more criminal in nature, anger is not in your repertoire to then be able to advocate for yourself, because it is a sort of tone or method of communication that has negative rather than like exclusively negative connotations. If you try and reach for anger, which is validly felt, you are trapped into a situation of sort of further demonizing yourself. And that's the case on a sort of philosophical and like social arguments level, but it's also very much the case on an individual level in one-on-one interactions with police officers or when you're giving evidence in court.
Laurie, if I can come to you, a brief description of Tony Abbott reminds me of this sort of line that you write in Bitch Doctrine about petty rage. And I wonder if we can unpack that a little bit, because I think, I mean, we're obviously talking about the usefulness of rage, and there's the opposite of when it's not useful. And yeah, if you can just elaborate on that a little bit more for our audience.
I don't suppose you could give me the line again. What did past me say? And can I back it up now?
Yeah, no, you said the rage that white men have been expressing loudly, violently over the idea that they might find themselves identifying with characters who are not white. This was in the context of popular culture.
Yeah, there is. Thank you. I think there is a very real sense in which cultures right now are held hostage to the petty rage of white male entitlement. And I think it is killing the world in very real senses. There is partly because I don't think it's ever been accurate to say that men are emotionally repressed. I think that is a line that many of us have been fed over our lives, that the real problem is that men need to express their emotions more. I think maybe that was true a couple of generations ago when the idea of masculinity was, entirely was very withholding, particularly of, white Western masculinity. You withheld everything, you kept it all, and you expressed yourself through physical rage sometimes, but rarely. But I think the problem is, certainly in my lifetime, the problem has not been that men are emotionally repressed. It's been that they are emotionally illiterate and so incapable, and not by nature, obviously, but there is a lack of learning and a lack of understanding among what is absorbed as masculinity of what an emotion actually is and what it means to feel one. And the upshot of that is that men, and in particular white, straight, cis men, are taught to experience their emotions as fact. They're taught to experience every feeling as something that must objectively be happening, which is hence the fuck your feelings crew turns into the feelings don't care, facts don't care about your feelings, because even if the facts that they're saying are completely irrational, completely illogical, not based on any kind of science, if we're talking about just some of the conspiracy theories that have been spewing all over the internet in the last climactic year. The idea is, particularly now that we live in an age where misinformation is more and more of a propaganda tactic, the idea that facts are pliable and can somehow be molded around individual feelings makes us more and more susceptible as a culture to this sense of being held hostage by white male rage. And white male rage is to be accommodated and pandered to. For years, many years, I've been told, and I've listened to people discussing very seriously what to do about all the angry young white men, and what to do about what it's mostly been men, particularly all the angry white people and their quote unquote legitimate concerns about whatever it is, whether it be Brexit and the idea that immigrants are coming to take everything we have, which, by the way, is really quite rich coming from Britain, or whether it is, men's fear that women are taking over everything, or white people's fear that somehow they won't have access to all of the privileges that they have grown up with the idea that they're entitled to. That kind of rage and the discomfort and the guilt and the fear that those things produce, that social change produces, it's often interpreted in the key of rage. And that rage is treated as a collective social problem. It has to be answered if the people who are angry are white men. And I find it very interesting that the only time you ever hear the cultural conservatives and political conservatives talk about the working class is when it's attached to the word white. You never hear people talking about, the legitimate concerns of the working class. But as soon as it's the white working class, then it is sort of made into an artifact of culture war that can be managed in this without having to deal with any actual substantive economic issues. It can just be, transposed into the key of racial resentment. Sorry, that was a bit of look at me. I don't think in a conversation about rage and dissent, I don't think I should allow the phrase "sorry, that was a bit of a rant" to come out of my mouth. But I started to say it, so sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
It made a lot of sense though, so thank you. I'll bring in an audience question at this point, and this one's from Sandra, and she asks, what does useful rage consist of, and how does it differ from ineffective forms? I might start with you, Bri.
That's a really good question. For me, I would go back to that thing I mentioned earlier, where I'm not sure I necessarily, as an individual, can always control my response and whether the response sort of gets forked into the useful versus hopeless side of things. What I actually find that is more a product of is the sort of colleagues and friends that I do advocacy work with. And it's just been the single most important and valuable lesson I've had to learn over the past, whatever it is, 4 years, since I really started getting involved in any of this kind of work, is it's what I thought the lesson was, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. But actually it's not even a marathon. It is in perpetuity. The work will never stop. You can go as hard as you want for as long as you want, and there will always be more that needs to be done. And on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, you just constantly have to be checking in with yourself and checking in with the people around you to make sure that it is sustainable. Otherwise, you absolutely burn out. There was a time in 2019 when finally the Queensland Attorney General had referred consent to the Law Reform Commission, and I just burnt out for, like, we got that win and then I just went to ground for sort of 2 or 3 months. And in hindsight, it's just really obvious that I hadn't been sort of managing that. But to answer the question more specifically, it's whether or not the energy that is like built up has an outlet. And to my mind, there is always more that can be done. But also whether or not it turns into sort of constructive energy or hopelessness is just whether or not you have people backing you, and people who can pick up the slack when you need a bit of a break, and people who can just talk shit with you for half an hour if you need a rest or whatever. And that's just, that's a lesson that I know for myself. I just have to keep relearning and relearning and relearning and re-remembering again and again.
It's interesting, like you say it's like, I know there's the phrase "it's a marathon, not a sprint" is a common one, but maybe it's neither, because marathons, both the marathon and the sprint, are races that you run by yourself. So maybe we're looking at something like it's a team effort. It's what's it called, the tug of war. And sometimes it's all right to take and it goes over a long, lifelong effort. And sometimes it's okay to sit out when you look. I shouldn't have gone into the territory of sports metaphors, because you can see me like I've come to the end of I'm like, hang on, is it an over? Are we talking about scoring? No, never mind.
So
The sentiment stands.
Just picking up on what Bri talked about, I mean, I'm very fascinated by this iteration of women's anger in Australia specifically. Earlier, I sort of mistook the dates of when the March for Justice thing happened. I thought it was last year. It actually was this year. Just tells you how this pandemic messes with time.
I remember it was the day I arrived in this country, the day. It was so odd, because I had hardly heard about it, because such similar things were going on in LA where I'd been before, and in the UK. And I arrived in hotel quarantine that day, and the marches were going on outside my window, and I just opened up the internet. What's going on out there? I kind of felt like I want to be down on the street, banging on the glass, but also reading. It's like a mirror world of the politics that have been going on in the UK and the US. It's the same themes coming up again and again. Women taking on institutions of power and formations of power and democracy, and the idea of democracy and who gets to be a citizen and who the law is supposed to protect. Even the characters. I mean, I know about Scott Morrison now. I didn't before, but it seems like all of your politicians. It's like it's the Australian remake of the last years. It's like, hang on, this guy is Ted Cruz, right? This is Australian Ted Cruz. Like, are we same basic? Anyway, sorry for interrupting.
I'm curious about, again, because it is in an Australian context, and I'm curious about newly politicized women. I went to those marches and I found them to be quite polite, actually. I sort of thought we were clapping, and I sort of thought, we're being killed, every week we're being killed, largely by men. And we're clapping about it. We're not, it felt, and I'm curious about this cultural, almost conservatism, if I can call it that, actually, where rage is not only police, but even in a context of a rally where you have every right to be angry. And there's a lot to be angry about in this country as well, not just when it comes to gender inequity. Bri mentioned the rates of Indigenous incarceration, climate change. I mean, you pick an issue, there's a lot to be angry about. And I wonder about how this rage is managed, how even within our own context, we suppress this rage as though we don't have the right to be angry. And then you look at movements in other parts of the world where women have just gone, enough is enough. We're not going to stop until you hear us. And I'm always curious about how that disconnect happens in the Australian context. And I've always wondered why, because I know that when it comes to marginalised communities, whether it's women of colour or Indigenous women, that protest is always happening, but it just never reaches the mainstream. And so I'm curious in terms of, Laurie, your observations of it, but Bri, how you've come to interpret it as someone that is born and raised in this country.
There seems to be this tension that advocates, lots of advocates, obviously I can't speak for everyone, but lots of advocates seem to feel where you get pressured to play by the rules if you want to make change. So it's advocating in the right way. It's agitating in the right way. It's giving speeches at rallies in the right way. It's trying not to make too many enemies or be too radical or too provocative, such that you might inhibit your chances of actually getting meetings with change makers or actually getting handshake photo opportunities and have MPs who actually want to work with you at some point in the future. And it's this in my experience, it was like one of the most difficult things to manage was like a perpetual calibration and recalibration of whether you were being like sort of crushed under the pressure to toe the line and be sort of not too threatening, not too upsetting, such that you didn't alienate the like MPs that you were trying to like convince of your position, and having to find new ways to get your point across. And it is a point which is, like you said, Santi, like we are being killed mostly by men. And I really, I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I know at the March for Justice that I went to in Sydney, there was a very powerful moment when someone mentioned in one of their speeches mentioned that, how to put this correctly, I'm sure we all remember when the diaries of the woman who made the allegations against Christian Porter were published. And I know for me personally, that was deeply troubling and very upsetting, and for a lot of other people I spoke to, sort of destabilizing and just devastating. And we were outraged. And at the march that I went to, someone mentioned that being published. And for a while, the crowd was yelling shame after the name Peter Van Onselen was mentioned. And I felt a moment there of rage collectively at the Sydney March. But I think you're right, Santi, that sometimes, I don't know if I know it is the case in Australia. Sometimes I wonder if our sort of leading voices and a lot of our advocates, I have no doubt that they would like to be a whole lot more antagonistic, and they feel the pressure to play the game in a certain way so that they don't alienate potential political allies who are actually pulling the strings.
Laura, if I can come to you, just picking up on what Bri said, and this idea of doing things the right way when we know that the systems were not built for anyone that was not a straight white man. I mean, the system will never work in our favor in that sense. What do you say to what Bri just mentioned?
Thanks. I think, Bri, honestly, I think you may have already answered your own question in a way previously when you say you don't know, what the answer is to whether or not you play the game or whether you're meant to be just, raising hell in the streets. I think you answered it already when you said that, it's about everybody. It's about everybody playing their role, and it's activism and advocacy are not. There is a thing, and I think I can't speak to an experience other than my own, which is, immigrant, white, British, middle class, female experience. But I think there is a lot of pressure on some women to feel like we need to be everything. We need to do everything ourselves. We need to take everything on ourselves, particularly in this sort of atomized, individualized culture. But actually, maybe you do need some people to put on the sharp suit and be able to speak very calmly to men who have somehow got into positions of immense power but are so fragile they can't bear to hear, contrary opinions spoken above a whisper. Somebody's going to have to do that. I realized really quite early on that I was never going to be able to do that because I'm really not very good up front at all. You've spent about 40 minutes with me and you may be able to guess this already, but that's okay, because the fact that there is still, it's been happening for a decade now, it's still happening. There is still an enormous groundswell of energy towards changing the conditions of women's liberation, changing the conditions of gender and racial liberation. This is, there are lots and lots of people out there. Nobody has to fight alone. And it's not just in-person protests that remind us of that. I don't have to get down on myself because I can't do that. I'm never going to be able to be the person who can be the work that you do, Bri. I respect it so much. I understand how hard it is from the about 2 months I spent about a decade and change ago trying to do it. I was like, nope, I'm out. This is like volleyball. I can't do it. Somebody else can, and I will support them and write angry things, saying what they probably wish they could say and can't. And I find, for me in my writing, channeling rage or trying to I can only ever really be angry when I write, which I don't know why that is. In person, I'm normally quite reasonably soft-spoken. But I find that writing in a way that is raw and accesses emotion as well as reason, it's about giving people permission. It's about giving people permission to feel the things they already feel. And some people get that on a protest with lots and lots of people, but of course that is policed in a different way. If a protest is an expression of public sentiment, it's really telling that so much energy goes into policing acts of even peaceful protests. Side note, in the UK at the moment, they're still trying to pass a bill which will make protests of any kind functionally illegal unless you get a permission slip from the government first. It is a really astonishing, like you could never, even in the United States, you could never get something passed like this. It's like the Home Secretary has the power to decide if you've caused a disturbance, and it's up to 10 years. Citation needed is absolutely crackers. But the way that expressions of emotion like that are policed in public, obviously it's been mentioned already how the way those protests are policed differs very depending on whose anger is considered a threat. I don't know if it made the news over here, But in March, there was a public demonstration around the murder of Sarah Everard in the UK, who was murdered by a police officer who has actually just been found guilty of her murder. And that protest was extremely heavily policed, which you'd think would be a bad look, right? You have several thousand women out there protesting police violence, and this seems like a good time for you not to do any more police violence. But apparently, it was really, and they filmed it. People were out there with their phones, and it was really brutal, and a lot of people were arrested. And the idea that suddenly this was a threat, particularly when it was, police trying to control public sentiment about one of their own, and the heavy-handed reactions to the Black Lives Matter protests. I wasn't, obviously, I'm not as aware of how the reactions to that were in Australia last year, but I was in the middle of Los Angeles in May, June, July last year, and it was, there were, look, I don't know as much as I should about the Australian police, but in the US, I have never been, it was like the whole city was under military lockdown. It was, there were armored tanks covered with soldiers with every kind of weapon you could possibly imagine, just rolling literally down our street. And we took a drive, me and another journalist, down to the middle of town, and it was just the whole thing was under lockdown. And yet the wild, angry Trump, anti-vax, anti-mask protests that were happening every Saturday, which were more of a threat to public safety because nobody was wearing a mask. Nobody was arrested on those, as far as I know. And some of those people were people who went and actually, invaded the nation's capital, and tried to overthrow the government 6 months later. It's, the way that anger is expressed and understood publicly is still very much in the gift of the police and the media and any government that cares to change the law to decide what anger is legible. But it doesn't just have to be physical protest anymore. That's one of the reasons I write, and I think it's one of the reasons that you both write and make films. I would imagine. There's a kind of, I think there are all kinds of ways of resistance, and there are all sorts of ways of making other people's anger legible and manageable. I mean, saying that, maybe it's a little ironic. I've dedicated quite a lot of my career to giving other people permission to be angry, and really, it's only the last few years. And you're younger than me, I think, Bri, and hearing you speak about, the uses you found for anger, even though it drains you sometimes, is really, it's really heartening, because I know that's something I still haven't found possible to do myself. I find my own anger, I find it terrifying, honestly. All I can do with it is write. But I often fear that it's going to overwhelm me, like you do when you're a very little child. You think that your anger is going to just burst out of you, and it'll either hurt you or it will hurt somebody else. Like it'll hurt your family. You have to keep it in. When you're 5, you're convinced you have that power. But yeah, it's wonderful to hear you talk about that in such a real way.
And just picking up on something that Laurie talked about, I'm curious then in terms of the ideas and the lessons that about these gender dynamics that are then passed on to young people, and especially in the context of gender inequity in this country, because, like I said, I mean, there's been a long history of organising and pushing for change, particularly from marginalised communities. It's been a consistent thing. It's just never really crossed over into the mainstream. But then you've got figures like Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins, largely middle-class white women, and all of a sudden it's a realization that, gosh, it can happen to us. Do you know what I mean? Like this idea that the reality of this facade of progress that we've sort of sold ourselves, that actually things are great for women, then that penny finally drops, because then anyone that's perhaps perceived themselves as being entitled or not being able to fall victim to the patriarchy in some sense, has this kind of awakening. And I wonder what we're then passing on to younger people if we are still confined by the limitations of a system that wants us to behave a certain way to maintain a certain status quo. Because if we continue to do things the right way, how do we expect things to really change? Bri.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Go on.
Right. Well, it's just that thing, right? The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And there is a way in which the media and the public in Australia clearly are not yet ready to hear all Me Too stories, because there is a way in which I am the same as Grace Tame is the same as Brittany Higgins is the same as Chanel Contas is the same. Mm-hmm. Where and I'm sorry, I mention myself only to implicate myself in that, not to claim any comparative level of efficacy. But if our movements that claim to be about improving the positions of all women continue to have this undeniable homogeneity of front women, we have questions to ask ourselves. It's just.
But why does that have to be why is that the wake up call that we need? I mean, if we have Aboriginal women constantly telling us that their lives are under threat by the state, by the systems, migrant women continue to remind us of this, but we're still refusing to listen. Why are we still only willing to listen to certain women when they're platformed, that we then realize, oh, actually, the system's pretty fucked?
Well, I think that they find it easier to receive that platform from the powers that be because they're they're less threatening because they don't pose as significant a challenge to as many layers of these systems of control. I think that there are a great number of women of colour and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander activists who've been doing incredibly powerful work against men's violence against women, who Scott Morrison would not have been as happy to stand up beside and shake the hand of on the dais of the Australia Day Awards. And that's not to take away from the achievements of Grace Tame, but I think surely it's not a controversial thing to say that there is an overlap between the homogenous image of the women who the media are willing to sort of crown as the face of the movement, because it's actually not too hard. There's not too much sort of scary or threatening about them. They don't pose as much of a threat to the status quo, because in Australia we love the status quo.
Laurie?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is incredibly telling how I've said before that the measure of oppression isn't how angry you are, it's how angry you're allowed to be, and particularly how legible your anger can be. And when it comes to women's liberation, it's very obvious that the people who are allowed to be angriest in public are in some ways the people who, at least we imagine, have less to be angry about. Not that there's any kind of objective measure of who is allowed to feel how much, but the people whose rage is perhaps not quite as terrifying to the status quo, which is why. But there is a way in which the work that does, moving outwards from the centre, is to give people permission. To give people permission to feel their feelings, although it doesn't necessarily give everybody permission. It creates I don't know. I think like you, Bri, I want to like acknowledge the incredible bravery of those women and acknowledge just how much effort and how much sacrifice it takes, while saying that yes, there's still something problematic here. And what's problematic is that we clearly can only, and again I say we as a culture just clearly doesn't care as much about the lives and the suffering and the humanity of women who are not white, straight, articulate, middle class, able-bodied, cisgender, because I have often been told, or I've often seen this happen. I don't know if this is something either of you have experienced, but when I see, and particularly online, although most of our experiences of politics over the last year and a half have been mediated by the internet in some way, but particularly online, when I see, say, trans women or women or women of color expressing or saying, again, often quite rationally, quite calmly, things that have happened to them, I often see men responding, and it's often men, not always, saying, not just you're lying about what you've experienced, but you don't feel like that. It's as if like you're making it all up. This is fake anger. And the idea, I think there is still a hangover from that deeply homophobic, deeply racist, deeply misogynist place that believes that in some ways, people who are not white, male, European sort of creatures of reason, quote unquote, also don't feel things in the same way. They don't really, and that was commonly thought until quite recently. That was a basis of moral and political philosophy, that that women just didn't have quite the same capacity to feel things and to be spiritual beings that men did, and that European people and white people had a much greater capacity for that kind of. They had more of that energy in general, and I think we're not so far away from that as a culture right now. And I think there is still. I think one of the ways that we cope with living in a world in which there is so much injustice is not just to deny the experiences of people who are othered, it's also to deny even the evidence of suffering, to deny it. I mean, I think back to that famous audio track, or the harrowing audio track of those children in cages at the Mexican border, crying for their parents, and the idea that, well, one of the things it did was show that the Trump regime as was and as wishes to be in the future very much positions itself as a strongman government which can inflict suffering if it's considered necessary. They're hard, they're not moved by that sort of thing, but also the idea that the suffering of children who are not white and English speaking is clearly registers in a different way on a human scale than, say, the suffering of made up children when it comes to things like the QAnon conspiracy, or as yet not existing children when it comes to the forced birth movement. It's I think because we're talking about rage and dissent, I think it is the question of whose emotions register as emotions and register as meaningful is I think it's very, very important right now.
Mm. And so, seeking justice and obviously holding people in positions of power to account does come at a cost. And you're obviously both familiar with what happens when you speak out about these sorts of things, when you try to raise awareness, when you try to get people to understand. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, because obviously, as much as it's wonderful to enlighten people about the usefulness of rage, I think it's also useful to, let people know that if you are going to get yourself into this path of seeking justice and wanting to see a better future, it does come at a cost. And I wonder if you could shed some light on that. I'll start with you, Bri.
something that I was not prepared for and that brought me a lot of pain was that I thought that I would be able to critique a system and make arguments for changing like the way things are done, and that people would respond to that with presumably their ideas to counter my ideas. What I did not anticipate, yeah, okay, naive, sure, whatever.
No, it's all right. I've been there.
What I did not anticipate was just character assassinations and nasty, like individual nastiness. And what really burned was, at the time, like I was still coming to terms with the fact that I had sort of torched any future legal career because I wanted, well, that's a decision I had to make when I finished my year as an associate and decided to go and make a police complaint instead of applying for a job at the TPP because I couldn't do both. And so I was still coming to terms with whether or not I just sort of sent like 6 years of law school down the gurgler and all that stuff. I'm thrilled to say now that I, never look back and it's all turned out great. But there is a way in which this profession, which is extraordinarily hierarchical and which is full of people who I previously did and a smaller number of people still do admire, that I felt were cruel and were just so nasty, and also just, though, frankly absurd. I remember one of our sort of most vocal opponents, an individual in a group within the Queensland Bar Association, would come out with statements like, these like advocates who are, none of them are even like practicing lawyers, so they couldn't possibly know what they're talking about, want to change a law that's been perfectly fine for 120 years. It's like,
has it though? Has it?
Yeah. So they're like, yeah. Anyway, it was quite brutal for quite a while, and it took a toll on my mental health for sure. Just seeing awful things written about me online and seeing my like credibility attacked, which was also, like, with hindsight, quite triggering as a survivor because I just finished going through an investigation and trial, and every time I was pitted against a defense barrister for a public debate, I would just get mad like sweats and just like flashbacks to actually being cross-examined by a defense barrister. But those were also the advocates I was up against for law reform. And it was just shitty. It was like really tough. And I couldn't have done it without a supportive partner, supportive friends, supportive family. I truly would not probably have just made it out the other side. Certainly not made it out the other side as someone now very capable of being happy and moving on. And the other thing that was the really big challenge was that I sort of felt a bit like when we got the referral I mentioned in mid-2019, obviously I didn't think like, okay, that's it, job done. But what then happened was that the Queensland Law Reform Commission spent about a year and returned a decision in which they said that rape myths were sometimes overstated, and that actually there were no problems with consent law in Queensland, and made a whole bunch of findings that directly contradicted the New South Wales Law Reform Commission's report. And we know that New South Wales Attorney General has now committed to a positive and affirmative consent standard. New South Wales, thanks to the extraordinary leadership of Mark Speakman, and really Saxon Mullins and the team at Resara, New South Wales is now ahead of the pack for consent law reform, and Queensland had to go back and put another 10-person task force together. And so it's just, I would say, not that you really asked for my advice, but more like the thing I learned is that you really cannot afford to fling yourself at a particular wall. Because there is no way that one wall, even if it comes down with your crushed body along with it, there's no way that one wall will be everything that you feel you are fighting against. You can't help anyone if you're not taking care of yourself first and foremost. And yeah, it's not even a marathon. It will go for as long as you want it to. So just take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Yep.
Laurie, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Oh, definitely. Well, firstly, I wanted to say that what you've done is brave and fantastic, and it matters. Even if it didn't necessarily bring the entire justice system to its knees in one go, you did good. And I hope you remind yourself of that every day. And I understand how significant a thing it is to put on the line a career you've been working for. And I've had similar things happen to me starting when I was in my very early 20s. Again, in a different career in different ways. I found that I really thought, and maybe this is a white girl thing, really, maybe it is. I was like, I thought I could just, challenge people and point out facts and problems in the public eye, and people would be fine and they would yeah, funny that. Guess what happened instead? Like there is a certain, honestly, one of the things I find is most precious and in some ways valuable about certain kinds of privilege within activist movement. It's the capacity to vastly underestimate human malice until it's too late. And sometimes you need people who don't know. Like sometimes you need those people to just be like, I'm sure it'll be fine. What could possibly go wrong? Those people, I mean, cannon fodder, yes. But, I think you're right, Bri, but also I think it brings us back to what we were saying at the start about playing by the rules and trying to, working at how angry you can get away with being within the system and, what you have to swallow and keep back in order to win change. And what I did learn quite quickly is that it really didn't matter how nice I was. It really did at the end of the day, because what I was saying was quite challenging. And as long as what you're saying or what you're proposing is a challenge or a threat to the status quo, you will be told that you're angry and irrational and insane. People will attack you and you'll need people to back you up. And honestly, the moment that you realize that, the moment that you realize that there's nothing you can do apart from dilute your message that will make people any less furious at you, it's quite freeing. It's freeing because honestly, you may as well say what you want in that case.
I think that's great advice. And I could keep talking to both of you for the whole night. But unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you both for joining me. I'd like to also thank the audience for tuning in. And if you're fired up by this conversation and would like to channel your rage, may I suggest buying Laurie or Bri's books via our bookseller Neighbourhood Books as an effective use of your rage. And hopefully you can continue the conversation going in your communities as well. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.